There are cases where the evidence seems to tell you exactly what happened. And then there are cases where the evidence raises an even more disturbing question. What was happening inside the mind of the person who did it? The Lindsay Clancy case has now reached that point. 3 children are dead. Their mother has admitted that she killed them, but she has pleaded not guilty, with her defense arguing that she was suffering from severe mental illness, including postpartum psychosis, and should not be held criminally responsible. The prosecution sees something very different. They see planning. They see preparation. They see a mother who sent her husband out of the house and then killed her 3 children. And now, as the trial continues, jurors are being shown something that could become critical to the final verdict. Lindsay's own digital trail. Searches involving psychosis. Searches involving hallucinations. Searches involving suicide. Searches involving psychiatric medication. And one particularly disturbing search. Can you treat a sociopath? But here's where this case becomes much harder to understand. Because knowing what Lindsay searched for doesn't necessarily tell us what was happening inside her mind when she searched for it. And that's why today, we're going to look at something very unusual. A conversation between journalist Brian Entin and a woman who personally experienced postpartum psychosis. Her name is Megan Clifle, and her story doesn't prove what happened to Lindsay. It doesn't tell us whether Lindsay was legally responsible. But it may help us understand something the courtroom evidence alone cannot. What psychosis can actually feel like from the inside. The Lindsay Clancy trial is currently focused heavily on her mental state before the deaths of her 3 children. Prosecutors and defense attorneys agree on the basic tragedy. 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan died inside the family's Duxbury, Massachusetts home on January 24, 2023. The dispute is what Lindsay's mental state was when she killed them. The defense says she was experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis. The prosecution says the evidence demonstrates deliberate action, and recent testimony has given the jury more information about the months leading up to that day. Lindsay had been seeking psychiatric care. She had been prescribed multiple medications. She had complained about depression, anxiety, insomnia, and intrusive thoughts. She had sought help more than once. She had also experienced suicidal thoughts. But the prosecution has emphasized something else. Healthcare providers did not report seeing evidence that Lindsay was planning to kill her children. One provider testified that Lindsay did not display psychosis during the period she was treating her, and that becomes one of the prosecution's strongest arguments. If Lindsay was experiencing psychosis, they ask, why didn't the professionals treating her recognize it? But the defense has challenged whether every provider actually had the complete picture. And that brings us to one of the central mysteries of this trial. Can someone be severely mentally ill without the people around them fully realizing it?
I'm actually going to talk to someone who also had postpartum psychosis. And it's a sensitive discussion to have because what she went through.
And had 3 children, but it was after the birth of her 2nd child that she experienced something she had never experienced before. And what makes her story particularly striking is that, according to Megan, she had no previous psychotic episode. She wasn't someone who had spent years expecting something like this to happen. She was a mother. She had a husband. She had a job. She was living what appeared to be a relatively normal life. And then, slowly, something began to change.
I would just say, my experience, I also experienced postpartum psychosis 8 months after the birth of my 2nd baby girl. It was very much like I went from kind of like not feeling like myself for months to then suddenly believing I was feeling like myself for months to then suddenly believing I was being followed and then surveilled and that my husband was in on this complex plot. Thankfully,
And that sentence is important. I don't feel like myself. Because that kind of statement can sound vague. It can sound like ordinary stress, exhaustion, depression, the overwhelming experience of having a newborn. But Megan says that eventually, something changed dramatically. She described her mind beginning to connect ordinary events into a completely different reality.
And suddenly I'm like the center of this complex plot. Everybody's out to get me. And my brain, I've actually never seen it move that fast before, but it was like pulling in any little detail that I was seeing on the subway and then knitting them into this reality that was totally diluted, but it was my new reality. It was like my new truth.
That final sentence may be the most important part of Megan's entire interview. They're my reality, not a possibility, not a suspicion, not something she was pretending to believe. Her perception had changed. And according to Megan, the things she was seeing and interpreting began to make sense within that new reality. She believed she was being watched. She believed people were communicating about her. She began changing trains and taking steps to avoid people she believed were following her. And then the fear followed her home.
In conversation with people, while in the background, my brain is just turning on, like, what's going on? What's this recruitment event about? How do I get out of it? And then the moment things took like a deeply different kind of fear turn was when my friend came up to me and she's like, who's watching June and Millie? And at that moment, I was like, oh, she's threatening me. She like knows this recruitment event.
This is where Megan's story becomes particularly relevant to the conversation surrounding Lindsay. Because Megan wasn't thinking about hurting her children. She said she believed she was trying to protect them. But that distinction demonstrates something crucial about psychosis. The person can potentially believe they're responding rationally to a situation that doesn't actually exist. That does not tell us that Lindsay experienced the same thing. And we need to make that distinction very clear. Megan's story is not evidence against Lindsay. It is not evidence for Lindsay. It is simply a first-hand account of what postpartum psychosis felt like for one woman.
And he orders sushi. I don't touch it. I think it's poisoned. We sit there and watch a show, and once the kids are in bed, and I'm kind of keeping it together, or I believe I am, and keeping it in, and then I start to have visual and auditory hallucinations, though at the time I didn't know that that's what they were. And
that's where the story becomes terrifying. Because Megan says the objects around her hadn't changed. The apartment hadn't changed. Her husband hadn't suddenly become an enemy. But her interpretation of those things had changed. The refrigerator became evidence. Food became dangerous. Television became a source of messages. Her husband became someone she couldn't trust. And eventually, police had to intervene.
The NYPD come and they handcuff me on the floor of our apartment, and I'm still totally deluded. I don't believe they're the NYPD. I get put in what I learn later is in an ambulance, but I don't think it's an ambulance. It's like everything I was believing was being corroborated, because like I think people are going out to get me. They do come to get me. I'm like pleading with two women that are in the ambulance, like, please, are either of you moms? Like, my kids are dying back there. They're obviously not turning. Everything cuts black. And that's when I get a shot in the arm. And then I eventually wake up in the 18 West Wing of Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. Although, again, at that point, I didn't believe I was in a psychiatric hospital because I was still deluded. And so then.
And even after she reached the hospital, Megan says she still didn't understand what was happening. She believed she had been captured. She believed the people treating her were part of the threat. That is an important detail because it demonstrates why simply telling someone they're mentally ill doesn't necessarily solve the problem. If the person's perception of reality has changed, the people trying to help them may actually appear to be part of the danger. And now we have to return to Lindsay, because this is where the comparison becomes both powerful and dangerous. It would be easy to watch Megan's story and say, that's what happened to Lindsay. But we cannot say that. We weren't inside Lindsay's mind. Megan wasn't inside Lindsay's mind. Brian Entin wasn't inside Lindsay's mind. The only people who can ultimately determine what Lindsay's mental state was are the experts, the evidence, and ultimately, the jury applying the law. What Megan's story does show is that severe psychiatric illness isn't always obvious to everyone around the person experiencing it, and that becomes particularly important when we look at Lindsay's medical history. By the months before January 2023, Lindsay had already been struggling. She had sought psychiatric treatment. She had been prescribed multiple medications. She reported severe insomnia. She described anxiety and depression. She experienced intrusive thoughts. She had suicidal thoughts. And she had contact with crisis services. But the treatment history was complicated. Different providers were involved. Different medications were tried. And according to testimony, Lindsay continued reporting problems even as treatment changed. The defense argues that this progression demonstrates a woman whose mental health was deteriorating despite repeatedly seeking help. The prosecution sees the same history differently. They point to the fact that Lindsay had access to professionals, and that those professionals did not conclude she was planning to kill her children. And now the jury has something else to consider. Her searches. Investigators testified about searches found on Lindsay's phone. Some involved hallucinations. Some involved psychosis. Some involved psychosis. Some involved psychosis. Medication. Others involved suicide. And then there was this. Can you treat a sociopath? That search was made shortly before the killings. The prosecution can use that evidence to argue that Lindsay was researching disturbing subjects before she acted. But the defense can point to the same digital trail and argue that it demonstrates something else. A woman searching for explanations for frightening mental experiences. And this is where the jury has to decide what those searches mean. Because a Google search doesn't come with an explanation. It doesn't tell you what the person was thinking when they typed it. It only tells you what they typed. The meaning has to be established through the rest of the evidence.
They call your name and they say Megan, and then I went out of my room and I willingly took the lithium and risperidol, and that then started to actually bring me back to reality, and eventually I'm like, oh.
That statement is important when considered alongside the prosecution's argument, because prosecutors can point to ordinary behavior, ordinary texts, ordinary conversations, ordinary interactions. But ordinary behavior does not automatically answer what was happening internally. At the same time, it doesn't prove psychosis either. And that's exactly why this trial is so difficult. On January 24th, Lindsay and Patrick communicated by text. The messages were not necessarily dramatic. They discussed ordinary matters involving the children, food, and medication. Patrick eventually left the house. According to prosecutors, Lindsay deliberately created that opportunity. The prosecution says this demonstrates planning. The defense disputes the interpretation of her actions and argues that her mental illness must be considered when evaluating what happened. And after Patrick left, the 3 children were killed. Lindsay then attempted to take her own life. She survived but suffered catastrophic injuries. She is now paralyzed, and that sequence of events is not disputed, in the same way her mental state is. The question is why. The defense has to convince the jury of something extremely difficult. Not simply that Lindsay was depressed. Not simply that she was overwhelmed. Not simply that she was taking medication. But that her mental illness was severe enough to affect her criminal responsibility. That's a much higher bar. And that's why the testimony about her symptoms, treatment, and possible psychosis matters. But it is also why the prosecution keeps returning to evidence suggesting planning. Because if Lindsay was carefully planning her actions, prosecutors will argue, that undermines the idea that she was completely disconnected from reality. The defense has to explain that evidence. Megan eventually recovered. She later had a 3rd child. And she created a detailed plan with her doctors and family to reduce the risk of another episode. But her experience also left her with a question about the Lindsay Clancy case. And this is where we have to stop and make something very clear. Megan is giving us her perspective. She isn't a medical expert testifying about Lindsay. She isn't a witness to Lindsay's final hours. And her experience cannot establish Lindsay's legal responsibility. But her comments raise a broader issue that has become impossible to ignore. What happens when a mother is showing signs of serious mental health deterioration, but the system doesn't recognize the severity of the emergency until it is too late? That question extends far beyond Lindsay Clancy. There is another side to this, and it cannot be ignored. The prosecution says Lindsay wasn't simply reacting to a sudden psychotic break. They argue she made deliberate decisions. They point to her searches. They point to her communications with Patrick. They point to the timing of his departure. They argue that she knew what she was doing. And they emphasize that mental illness does not automatically make someone legally insane. That distinction is critical. A person can have depression. A person can have anxiety. A person can take psychiatric medication. A person can even suffer from a serious mental illness. And none of those facts automatically determine criminal responsibility. The jury has to consider Lindsay's actual mental state at the time of the killings and apply the legal standard. And now we arrive at the question that has been hanging over this trial from the beginning. Was Lindsay Clancy planning the deaths of her children? Or was she experiencing a psychiatric crisis so severe that her understanding of reality and her ability to control her actions were profoundly affected? The evidence currently being presented can be interpreted in radically different ways. The search for suicide methods can look like preparation, or it can be viewed alongside her documented suicidal thinking. The search for psychosis can look like research, or it can be viewed as evidence that she was trying to understand disturbing symptoms. Her ordinary texts can look like evidence that she knew exactly what she was doing, or they can be viewed as evidence that someone experiencing psychiatric illness can still appear outwardly functional. Her medical history can look like proof that she was receiving substantial care, or it can raise questions about whether the different providers understood the full picture. That is the battle happening inside this courtroom. And this is why I believe Brian Entin's conversation with Megan is worth hearing. Not because it solves the Lindsay Clancy case. It doesn't. Not because it proves the defense's argument. It doesn't. But because Megan provides something extremely rare, a first-hand explanation of what it can feel like when reality itself begins to change. She described being afraid of people who weren't actually following her. She described interpreting ordinary objects as threats. She described believing loved ones were part of a conspiracy. And she described how convincing those beliefs felt while she was experiencing them. That doesn't tell us whether Lindsay experienced the same thing. But it reminds us that the question of mental state cannot always be answered simply by looking at someone's behavior from the outside. So where does that leave us? We know Lindsay's children died. We know Lindsay survived a suicide attempt. We know she had a significant mental health history before the killings. We know she sought professional help. We know she took multiple psychiatric medications. We know investigators found searches involving mental illness and suicide. We know prosecutors argue those searches support a theory of planning. We know the defense argues they are evidence of a woman experiencing a severe psychiatric crisis. And now we know, through Megan's first-hand account, that postpartum psychosis can sometimes involve a terrifying distortion of reality that the person experiencing it may genuinely believe. But one thing remains critically important. Megan's story is not Lindsay's story. We cannot take one woman's experience and use it as proof of another woman's mental state. That determination belongs to the evidence in Lindsay's case, and ultimately, to the jury. The Lindsay Clancy trial is far from over. More witnesses are expected. More medical evidence will be examined. More digital evidence will be interpreted. And the prosecution and defense will continue offering two completely different explanations for the same devastating events. Was this a calculated act? Was it the result of severe psychiatric illness? Or is the truth more complicated than either side's simplest explanation? Those are the questions this trial must answer. And as the evidence continues to come out, we'll continue separating what is proven, what is alleged, and what remains unknown. Because in a case this serious, the difference matters. 3 children lost their lives. A mother is on trial. And the central question, is no longer simply what happened. It's what was happening inside Lindsay Clancy's mind when it happened. This is Brian Case Records. If you want to follow the latest developments in the Lindsay Clancy trial, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone following the case.